Meanwhile, hundreds of mourners lined up in the rain yesterday to pay their final respects as a public viewing for Rayshard Brooks, a black man who was fatally shot by a white Atlanta police officer in the parking lot of a Wendy's just about 10 days ago. People filtered through quietly, masked and socially distant to pay their respects as Mr. Brooks lay in his casket at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta during a 4-hour public viewing. A closed funeral will be held today for Brooks at the church, where Martin Luther King Jr.'s youngest daughter, the Reverend Bernice King, is expected to speak. Joining us now, CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation, best-selling author and combat veteran of the United States Army, Wes Moore. He's the author of the new book out today entitled 5 Days, The Fiery Reckoning of an American City. Wes, it's great to see you again. As you know, I've read the book. It is phenomenal. It speaks to our times. It's a story of Freddie Gray's death 5 years ago in the city of Baltimore, where you are from. What echoes in the death and reaction to Freddie Gray do you see in what's happening in the streets right now?
Well, I think what the echo we're seeing is really an echo for justice. And, you know, it's interesting because some people say, well, the story of 5 days is very timely. And I think part of the challenge and part of the heartbreak is name a time when it wouldn't be timely to tell this story. You know, we have a long history of what it means to watch inequitable policing being displayed on our streets. We also have a long history of inequitable living conditions that exist, the inequity of economics, the inequity of health. And so I think right now what we're seeing both with this story of 5 days, and even when you look at how Freddie Gray, how the interaction first happened, you know, let's be clear about what Freddie Gray did to first have the interaction with police in the first place. He made eye contact with police and ran. Now that's important because that's only something that's probable crime in certain neighborhoods. In certain high crime neighborhoods, if you run from the police and that's all you've done wrong and they can give chase and detain you. Everywhere else, you're just out for a job. And so we're watching how this continues to show itself. And frankly, I think we're watching a community who is saying, if we cannot have an honest conversation about justice now, if we can't bend the moral arc of history now, if we cannot have a moment where we can stop repeating these incidents now, then there is never going to be a time where we're going to be able to do it.
And one of the themes you get at in this book, Wes, is that the end of Freddie Gray's life was the end of a story that began when he was a baby. And I think that's something we're hearing in the streets right now, is that, yes, this is about chokeholds, and yes, this is about no-knock warrants and qualified immunity. But upstream from these moments, there is so much more at the root.
That's exactly right. The thing that's at the root, and we talk about these things, these changes we need to make in policing like they're a cause, and they're not. They're an effect. When we're looking at the cause, we're looking at issues of poverty, and we're looking at issues of racism. It's understanding the fact that race is one of the most reliable predictors of life outcomes across several areas, including life expectancy, including academic achievement, income, wealth, physical, mental health. It's looking at the fact that Freddie Gray, as a young man, never had a chance. You know, Freddie Gray was born underweight, premature, addicted to heroin. His mother battled addiction much of her life. She never made it to high school. She gave birth to twins, and once they were finally once they finally had gained enough weight to leave the hospital, they moved into a housing project in West Baltimore. That housing project, that house that they moved into, along with 400 other homes, was in 2009 named in a class action lawsuit. And that lawsuit was because of the endemic levels of lead inside of their house, where the CDC indicates that 5 microns of lead in every deciliter of blood is enough to make a person cognitively damaged for the rest of their life. Well, Freddie Gray had 36. And so here was a young man who was born underweight, addicted to heroin, lead poisoned. And by that time in his life, he's 2 years old. So Freddie Gray never had a chance. That last encounter that he had with police, where he just simply made eye contact with police, the reality is Freddie Gray could have died 100 times before that. And so if we're going to have a conversation about justice, it does need to include all the things that you mentioned, Willie. It does need to include the fact that we do not have equitable policing in certain neighborhoods. It also has to understand the fact that poverty and race matter in the context of everything we're talking about when we're talking about bringing justice of all forms into societies and communities.
Mike Barnicle.
Wes, let's talk a little bit more about the roots, as you just referred to. And it's an epidemic of bad roots all around this country. But in the case of Freddie Gray, if you could talk about what happens when he becomes 5, 6 years of age and he's in a public school system. And I don't want to denigrate public school teachers in bad situations, in bad school systems, in bad neighborhoods. It's usually the best teachers want to go to where they're needed the most. But in Freddie Gray's case, the concept of just, well, Freddie's trouble, he's difficult, he has no parents, he's rootless, let's just push him through school. And the indifference that comes with skin color. He's a young black child. Let's just push him up to 4th grade, 5th grade, get him out of here. And then you end up with Freddie running from eye contact with a police officer. Talk about that syndrome.
Yeah, and I think we have to understand all the various touch points that either, touch Freddie or frankly, to your point, Mike, didn't touch Freddie. Right. I mean, when we think about the education system as a whole, where, Freddie Gray's last day of attendance, documented day of attendance in the Baltimore City public school system was when he was in 10th grade and he was 19 years old. Because of the lead poisoning, Freddie Gray had spent his entire academic career in developmental coursework in special education classrooms. And so we watched something where because of the poison that was introduced into his body from such a young age, we were then asking our teachers to turn around and perform essentially an impossible task. And so, as we think about what it means to have a school system that can truly support all students, regardless as they come in, there first needs to be, how are we dealing with the fact that, that we're still having a disproportionate amount of children who are entering school unprepared, a disproportionate amount of children who are dealing with issues before they even walk into their first classroom. And then, frankly, we think about the schools and the structures that we have our kids attending. The reality is we're saying everything to our children about what we expect from them and about how we expect them to perform simply by the buildings that we're asking them to be in. The fact that we still currently, right now in Baltimore City, have schools where kids cannot drink the water because of lead, where schools look more like places of incarceration than they do with places of education. And so how we think about that pathway, the fact that education is really the only quantifiable mechanism we have to create sustainable economic mobility for people, if we can't put a core focus on that and being able to give our kids a platform, then we end up putting ourselves in a very expensive predicament, which is looking at the cost of rehabilitation and incarceration later on down the line. It costs our nation over $1 trillion every year to deal with child poverty. Child poverty costs this country over $1 trillion a year. And that's a very expensive bet that we're making on the fact that we're not even giving kids from everything from early childhood to the schools that they attend a reasonable shot and a reasonable education at being able to taste success.
So, Aaron Haynes, everything we're talking about right now has to do with believing the 3 words, Black Lives Matter. And we are at a moment in our political history where there are literally some politicians and a president and a vice president who won't say those words, let alone whether or not they believe them. This is something that can be solved at the ballot box. Today is primary day in a number of states. If you could tell us about Kentucky and how Black Lives Matter is potentially playing out in that race, the primary today, for the person who is hoping to run against Mitch McConnell.
Yes, I think this primary happening on the 102nd day where the people accused of killing Breonna Taylor have not been arrested looms over the election in Kentucky, particularly in Louisville, where there is one precinct in a stadium, yes, but one precinct for hundreds of thousands of people to cast a ballot. And so they're thinking about being able to vote safely in an environment where we know that Black people are being disproportionately affected by a deadly virus. The question of Black Lives Matter, both from a public health, from a policing standpoint, from all the inequalities that Wes mentioned is on full display in this pandemic today. And, voters in that community are wondering how their elected officials plan to respond and plan to show concern for their health and their safety going forward. That is also a huge part of this conversation. And I think that, as I've been saying, even before this pandemic, that race and racism is on the ballot for a lot of voters. It is a survival vote for many Black voters, what's happening in this primary and what's happening going into November. And I think that the return of the Black Lives Matter movement in the midst of this pandemic is a reminder of that for many voters. And so, I think that is potentially what you could see playing out in this primary today in Kentucky. You have a candidate that has surged because he has raised issues of racial injustice and wanted to confront that, challenged his opponent, who he has said has not really spoken to those issues. Even Mitch McConnell said that the Breonna Taylor case was something that needed to be looked into. And they managed to pass a law, before these officers were even arrested for, allegedly executing one of the no-knock warrants that law is now designed to prevent. What does that say to the residents of that community?
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.